Tibet is indeed a very special place. Tibet was one of the last land formations that came up some 50 million years ago. In concert with Tibetan legends, Tibet emerged from the oceans to become the highest plateau in the world. And some 20,000 years ago, the first Tibetans started to live in that area. And through their lives on this plateau, have also found a way to live in harmony with nature. There are many ways to explain this, but basically the Tibetans respected the land and found a way to live without exploiting it or destroying it. And later the Tibetans discovered Buddhism, and it added to Tibet's sensibilities about how to live with fellow man. Even though Tibet was not advanced in economics and modern industry, it was a very humane and very peaceful society in many regards. The Chinese make claims that Tibet has essentially always been a part of China. One of the first reasons often stated is that Tibet became a part of China when the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century took on a Chinese princess as his wife. And they point to that as sort of the beginning of Tibet becoming part of China. I think they deliberately neglect to mention that at that time the Tibetan king was actually quite a powerful entity in that part of the world, and the Chinese princess was not given out of free will, so to speak, but under a lot of Tibetan pressure, military pressure, and that the Tibetan king in fact had a Tibetan queen, and he also had a Nepalese princess as a queen as well. So as kings and emperors go in those times, I think you had more than one queen or one wife. And so using the Chinese princess as an excuse to say Tibet is part of China, doesn't really hold much. The other reason given sometimes when this argument becomes a bit weak is that the Chinese will say, well, Tibet definitely became a part of China in the Yuan dynasty, when direct control was exercised over Tibet. And for those who are not familiar with Chinese history, they need to be aware that when they talk of the Yuan dynasty, they are actually talking about the Mongol rule of China. Kublai Khan, the great grandson of Genghis Khan, was the head of the Yuan dynasty. In fact, the Chinese empire, the Chinese nation fell under Mongol rule, and when the Mongolians conquered and ruled most of the known world in the 13th century, it was not just the Tibetans or the Chinese, but practically all of Central Asia, all the way up to Central Europe when the Mongols ruled. So because the Tibetans in fact, had a special relationship with the Mongols, and Tibet was not directly conquered and ruled. So to use that connection as justifying Chinese, rule over Tibet is sort of a clever misinterpretation of history. If we follow that logic, then we would have to say present-day Burma should be part of India because it was once part of British India, And then, of course, one of the more contemporary reasons is that the People's Liberation Army, Communist China, came into Tibet because Tibet was a backward feudal society, and that Tibet had to be rescued from Western imperialism or Western imperialists. The fact of the matter is, when China invaded Tibet in 1950 or around that time, there were no ties with the Western world. In fact, there were only like 2 or 3 Westerners in all of Tibet. So that's just an outright, falsehood that Tibet needed to be rescued from Western imperialists. And then to categorize Tibet as a feudal, backward, oppressive society is first of all, it's a very Marxist socialist terminology which the Chinese are using based on how society might have been in Europe 100 or 200 years ago. The basic sort of Chinese attitude has been, shall we say, very colonial in nature. So all their policies are set in a manner in which the Tibetan people, Tibetan culture, Tibetan language, Tibetan way of life is secondary in value to the Chinese way of doing things. So with that sort of very basic, position, their policies are obviously not going to favor anything that indicates Tibetan identity or a Tibetan way of doing things. And then the belief is also very strong that, as we talked earlier, that Tibet is part of China. And to reinforce that, they have to make Tibet look more like China. So therefore, the emphasis on teaching Chinese, learning Chinese, doing things the Chinese way, not providing any kind of real support for the development or the continuation of Tibetan language and culture and Tibetan customs. So by the very nature of how they have looked at Tibet right from the beginning, has been harmful to Tibetan interests. And because Tibetans have protested, and many have protested out of desperation, even taken arms against the Chinese in the early 50s and resisted the Chinese have reacted with even greater violence. So according to our claims, Tibetan claims, out of some 6 million Tibetans on the Tibetan plateau, over 1.2 million Tibetans have died as a direct result of Chinese policies. They range from actual numbers killed in direct conflict with the Chinese from the 1950s onwards, people who've died in prison or who've committed suicide or who've died out of starvation situations, and people who've died during the Cultural Revolution. Destruction in Tibet also records over 6,500 monasteries and temples destroyed in Tibet by the Chinese between the early 1950s to 1979, or around the end of the Cultural Revolution. Every monastery, every temple in every town, in every village was essentially destroyed during this period.
I was born in Tibet, and when I was 5-6 years old, my parents escaped in 1959 following His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That was a very tragic day for Tibet when the Chinese communists forced into Tibet and occupied Tibet.
I was born and raised in Tibet during the Cultural Revolution. Sometimes, we go like 2-3 days without food. My parents and elder brothers and sisters, they would have to go to work every day without a day off. And then end of the day, they would have some kind of meeting. What happens at the meeting is Chinese authorities would sit up on the stage, and then they would pick some individual, bring them on the stage, and then they would pick up another individual, and then they would force that individual to beat up the other individual. Sometimes they would bring the father up and then bring up the son, and they would force the son to beat up the father. So they would bring the teacher first and then bring the disciple later, and then they would force the disciple to beat up the elder monk, which is the teacher. People just collapsed because of too much work every day, too much physical torture, and a lack of food. They would collapse, and then the Chinese authority would just bury them alive.
These people who are almost dead, they were put together with the dead people, and then they were buried alive. We know that already, that there has been acts of cruelties even done to the monks and nuns, even to the women now, in order to stop the procreation or the population, Tibetan population. They do sterilization without anesthesia, and they do sterilize a woman like that.
They also began policies such as patriotic re-education classes requiring monks and nuns to denounce His Holiness the Dalai Lama and to swear their loyalty to the Communist Party. And these have also continued and increased in the past several years. We've also, I'm sure many of you have heard of the policy that carrying an image or a photograph of the Dalai Lama is illegal and can lead to imprisonment or fining. And even, professing support for him gets you labeled as a splittist or a counter-revolutionary. So monks and nuns are under constant surveillance, and they face increased restrictions, such as even being banned from government buildings and being unable to perform certain religious ceremonies without permission from the Communist Party.
China is destroying Tibetan environment in the name of development to help Tibet, to bring benefits to the Tibetan people. But what is really happening here is all the jobs go to Chinese people, and the Tibetan people don't get any job or any benefit at all. And even though they build a road, then they never meant for Tibetans, because Tibetans don't even need a road because they only have yaks and horses, and only people that drive vehicles are Chinese. And if you follow those roads all the way into the mountains, and then you ended up at a checkpoint where you can no further go, which means there is either a military base or mining.
Since Deng Xiaoping came back, overall you could say the situation may have improved a tiny bit, and with China becoming slightly more developed economically and tied in a little bit with the rest of the world, but it still is very oppressive.
They realized after liberalizing Tibet momentarily in the early 1980s that what happened was an immediate resurgence in Tibetan resistance to Chinese occupation, an immediate sort of gathering of a new sense of Tibetan nationalism and identity, which they immediately sought to crush, and then afterwards followed up on with what they called the Strike Hard campaign. And this campaign was primarily aimed at monks and nuns because they were many of the leaders of the protests that took place in the mid-1980s and late 1980s in Tibet. Monks and nuns, often didn't have the same connections of children or families to worry about, and also because they felt the brunt of the repression because of the targeting of the religious community, they were often the ones who started the protests and were out in the streets, demanding freedom.
Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese premier, way back in 1979, stated that except independence, everything can be discussed. And so that was actually in response to that, His Holiness has come out that he doesn't, fight or ask for independence. He wanted a greater or the genuine autonomy for Tibetan people within the framework of China's constitution.
The Tibetan people in exile, overwhelming majority, have decided to support His Holiness's proposal, which is not seeking independence for Tibet, but genuine autonomy for all Tibetans in all three regions of Tibet, Kham, Amdo, and Uitang. It is in their interest and interest of the Chinese people and the Tibetan people that we can resolve this peacefully without resorting to violence or arms. And the Dalai Lama has convinced all of us that we are willing to forego independence as long as we are given genuine autonomy and basic rights.
He has been advocating for the middle way approach, which is to remain within the Chinese constitution, but getting a greater autonomy, meaningful autonomy for the Tibetan people, so that Tibetan people can preserve their culture, their religion, their identity in Tibet. The Chinese government wanted to know what the genuine autonomy means for the Tibetans. So those are basically all those provisions like human rights, like freedom to religion, freedom to expression, and the right to preserve your culture, your identity as a minority within the framework of Chinese constitution. The Chinese leadership said that this is again a independence, call for independence in disguise. But it was very clear that the Chinese government was not sincere in actually bringing a solution to the Tibetan problem.
The Chinese government has not moved on the issue of Tibet. They actually said they did not recognize the right of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile to represent the 6 million Tibetans.
Ti
belief and practice in rebirth and reincarnation is a sort of a very unique Tibetan Buddhist traditions, especially the part about finding reincarnated lamas.
His Holiness has been proven the undisputed leader of Tibetans inside and outside Tibet.
The present Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has proven to be an exceptional human being, an exceptional Dalai Lama, and so the Tibetan people have an extremely high regard for him. So when he passes away, which we still hope will be maybe many years down the line, it's very likely that the Tibetans will look for the next reincarnation. I don't know exactly how that will unfold, but at least traditionally or in the past, in the previous Dalai Lamas, when they've passed away, the Tibetan government have actually taken charge of the search. And the reason for that is because the Dalai Lama, or the institution of the Dalai Lama, for the last almost 400 to 500 years has been like the head of state of Tibet, both the temporal and spiritual head of Tibet. And so when he passes away, the government will actually first of all establish a regency, somebody to hold the place instead of the Dalai Lama, a regent. And then the government will also probably put together a committee that will search for the next Dalai Lama. So even though we are not in Tibet right now, for the last 50 years we have had a government in exile, a structure under the Dalai Lama, quite different from Tibet now, because now it's very democratic, but we do have a government structure. And the most likely scenario is that this exile government will establish a regency and a search committee.
Historically, there was a regency between the two Dalai Lamas, and these regions, office of this regency, were occupied by whoever happens to be a senior most Lama, reincarnated Lama, among several eligible reincarnated Lama institutions. So you have Temeling, you have Kundaling, and you have Tata, a couple of these very high reincarnated Lama institutions. So, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but the system was there. Now that system has been completely broken down. That system just doesn't exist. Historically, there has been very close teacher-disciple relationship between Panchen Lamas and the Dalai Lamas, and that's one of the reasons why the Panchen Lama institution came to be very successful, and almost from a kind of a spiritual, theological point of view, on par of equality with the Dalai Lama institution itself. The fact that we refer to the Dalai Lama institution as being higher is more from the political point of view, but from the religious point of view or a theological point of view, they're really seen as equal. And seniority is really determined by whoever happens to be the master in a particular life. Depending upon whatever period you may happen to be, sometimes Panchen Lama is the senior and the teacher, and the Dalai Lama is the junior and the disciple. And then sometimes it's the other way around. Because the relationship between the Panchens and the Dalai Lamas became so intimate, a teacher-disciple relationship that was repeated over several generations, this relationship became a kind of an important ideal of relationship between a master and disciple that is so central to the Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism.
The late Panchen Lama, when he was young and grew up in northeastern Tibet, he and his monastic group was basically totally embraced by the Chinese communists. So he practically grew up under very close attention, focus, guidance by the Chinese communists. And that is where, when the Dalai Lama first visited China in 1954, the Panchen Lama would basically be almost on the same level, as the co-leader of Tibet. Whereas historically, only the Dalai Lama assumed a role as the head of state. And the Panchen Lama, as famous and as revered a figure, he was in Tibetan history, he was never a political leader. So throughout the 50s and right up to the 60s, a large number of Tibetans were in fact very skeptical of the late Panchen Lama, and they were not sure where his sympathies and where his allegiances were. But then after the mid-60s, the Panchen Lama was also locked up by the Chinese for 19 years, 15 years, and he in fact turned out to be a very courageous person who spoke out against Chinese misrule in Tibet, and also did a lot to revive many of the monastic institutions and other critical needs of Tibet in the 1980s until he passed away.
Since the previous Panchen Lama passed away, the situations worsened in Tibet, because at least until he passed away, he was a very strong and very sort of courageous voice concerning Tibet. He was not in a position to speak specifically of political issues and changes, at least not in public, but he was able to be very vocal about cultural and religious needs and rights and protections that he could try and bring about. So in the last 10 years of his life, he played a very sort of vital role in the revival of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, especially at least in the physical aspect of rebuilding monasteries and temples.
The Panchen Lama always has his own physician, bodyguard that travels with him. But that time when he came to Shigaze, they changed those things. They replaced the bodyguard. They sent a new one. They changed his physician. They sent a new one. He was okay today. He was teaching. He was full of life. He was normal. And the next day, they found him dead. And they didn't want autopsy to be performed on Panchen Lama's body. That in my mind, and all the people in Tibet that I know, we don't ever doubt that the Panchen Lama was murdered in 1989.
Since he's passed away, there have been no prominent Tibetan figures who've been able to draw attention like he did. And of course, after he passed away, his monastery went through the process of finding his reincarnation, and they carried out a very extensive search, and finally they had a number of candidates, and I believe they consulted His Holiness the Dalai Lama in exile, and His Holiness confirmed a candidate as the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama. But soon after, the Chinese government stepped in and completely rejected that confirmation, and instead chose another child as the official Panchen Lama.
The Panchen Lama, as we've heard, is such a significant religious and political figure for the Tibetan people that his abduction really hit a chord with the entire Tibetan community in exile and in Tibet, and the international community, because a 6-year-old child, the world's youngest political prisoner at the time of his abduction, instantly grabbed headlines, and it's just inherent to believe that it's wrong, and there's nothing a 6-year-old child could have done to deserve this kind of treatment. We see that the Chinese state and that the CCP is kind of going about this in a very strategic and targeted and systematic way, and that it wasn't just random, obviously, that they decided to abduct the Panchen Lama, and that a lot of the political prisoners that have been targeted in recent years have been very carefully planned out by the party. When they know that when they attack Tibet's religious system and institutions, they're targeting the cornerstones of Tibetan identity and targeting Tibetan nationalism, which is what they fear the most, more than anything.
To an overwhelming number of Tibetans, many Mongolians, thousands of Himalayan people in 3 different nations, the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama are the living bodhisattvas. Tibetans believe that when Tibet was going through a difficult time in our history, the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama came as a divine intervention to relieve them from the suffering and guide them into the spiritual path. The followers of these 2 lamas believe that their fate and destiny is intertwined with that of Panchen Lama and Dalai Lama. As such, when the Tibetans search for the next reincarnation of the 2 lamas, they go through a period of soul searching, a time of ceaseless prayers, countless propitiations, and invocations of different deities. The chosen child is not a lottery winner, but the answer to the prayer of the nation. In choosing their Panchen Lama, China succeeds at making a mockery of the faith of the Tibetan people and undermining the 2 most revered institutions of Tibet.
So we have a very complicated issue in Tibet now, where the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama, that there are 2 reincarnations, one which has been confirmed by the Dalai Lama, who is missing essentially, that we have no knowledge of his whereabouts or his condition, and the official one which the Chinese government has taken care of, and who is being trained and groomed to be the official Panchen Lama. The problem is not going to be easily resolved, because I think a large percentage, I have no way of putting an exact figure, but a very large percentage of the Tibetan public do not really accept the Chinese Panchen Lama.
They're having a hard time saying that the Panchen Lama right now, Tibetans call him now, instead of Panchen Lama, they call him Panchen Zuma. Zuma means a fake.
If you take the case of the Panchen Lama right now, the one officially recognized by the Chinese, I think he is also having a lot of difficulty coming into Tibetan areas. If he wants to visit a monastery or visit a certain part of Tibet, there are all kinds of excuses being made by Tibetan monasteries and others. Either something's under renovation, or the weather isn't quite right, or the ceremony date doesn't fall on an auspicious date. There are all kinds of excuses. So he can't make his presence really felt in Tibet. And it's primarily because the majority of the Tibetans are not really accepting him.
Chinese communists, ideologically, they do not believe in any religion. They think that religion is opium and it's a poison. Now they have come out with a lot of measures about the reincarnation, and they actually wanted to control the reincarnation of the Tibetan lamas.
The systematic repression of religious life and institutions by the Chinese government is really their way of trying to suppress and wipe out any sense of Tibetan ethnic unity or identity or coherence. One of the examples of this sort of increased attention to repressing the religious community more recently was State Religious Affairs Bureau Order Number 5, and this came out in 2007, and it was an order that essentially gives the Chinese Communist Party the authority and the right to approve reincarnations of tulkus or lamas. And without that approval, they're not legitimate and they're not legal or allowed to exist. So you cannot reincarnate without their permission. And this also applied retroactively to already recognized lamas and tulkus. And so this order reveals the party's agenda to undermine the legitimacy of Tibetan religious leaders, who they see as their largest threat, because they know that religious leaders, with their charisma and with the trust that they garner from the Tibetan people, have a considerable amount of influence and have the ability to go against the CCP policies and potentially sway masses of Tibetans or communities into those thoughts as well. This order also indicated a more aggressive and consistent approach from the CCP to regulating and repressing the religious institutions, and an attempt to strengthen their position as the official sort of arbiter of Tibetan Buddhism. It also essentially claims the Tibetan system of recognition and education is no longer relevant or legitimate, and that it comes down to the government's decision in the end. And as we've seen with the Panchen Lama, they also seek to influence that religious leaders' upbringing and education and make sure that they grow up into a very loyal party advocate.
Only the Tibetan people have the right to elect their leader. Even His Holiness has been personally very concerned about it. He has also been thinking about devising some other mechanism of recognizing the Dalai Lama. He has even suggested that, like Pope, should we have a sort of collegiate, which will decide the future Pope or the future Dalai Lama. Or in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there have been some lamas who have recognized the next Lama by himself before he expired, during his lifetime. So which means that the Dalai Lama can appoint someone as his reincarnation, even when he's alive. But he has said number of times, it is first and foremost for the Tibetan people to decide whether they want the next Dalai Lama or not. If they want the next Dalai Lama will not be born in a Chinese occupied Tibet or under the Chinese rule, because the next Dalai Lama has to carry forward the work of the previous Dalai Lama, so he will be outside.
Dalai Lama has indicated that his reincarnation will be born in a free country, and we have to believe, we have to live with it, with this hope and inspiration.
So what happens after the present Dalai Lama passes away is a very big open question, because I don't think the regency system that worked in Tibet is going to work, because that is very heavily aligned to Gelug tradition. And now in the exile community, the political system has been formally democratized, so there is no affiliation with any particular Tibetan tradition, Tibetan schools, let alone Gelug. So therefore, the regency system that worked in Tibet is not going to work, because they're all very explicitly Gelug institutions. Now then the question is, what would facilitate a successful period during the present Dalai Lama and the next one? Then as far as the political office is concerned, that's one of the things that His Holiness has worked really hard to democratize it, so that the political leadership of the Tibetan people is elected, purely through the ballot system, and a period of 5 years, and effectively since I think it was 2002 or 2001, we have a first minister system, Kalun Tipa system, who is effectively the political leader. Then you have the formal position of the Dalai Lama,
So in the, say, for example, in the idea analogous to the British monarchy system, or some nominal, head of the people, that needs to be worked out.
And that is why Dalai Lama has democratized Tibetan government, and especially in many times he has said that he wants to be out of the Tibetan political system, simply because he sees that it is very impossible to have a genuine democracy with having the Dalai Lama system. So because of this democratic system, I think that, as Tugela said about the election, even without Dalai Lama, I think things will go on, because there is a now well-channeled democracy system among in the Tibetan community, Tibetan in exile.
Dalai Lama is a democratic-leaning person. He has initiated democratic processes. Now, the irony is the Tibetan government will be a full-fledged democratic system when he will be replaced by a democratic elected head of the government. So thereby I propose a solution, perhaps a provocative one, that 15th Dalai Lama be the head of the state and the spiritual leader, but the head of the government be democratically elected by the people. So we have both spiritual and democratic legitimacy, because Tibetan people in Tibet are very religious minded. Hence the spiritual legitimacy will maintain the bridge and the connection and solidarity with Tibetans inside Tibet and outside Tibet. Now who should be the 15th Dalai Lama? Now I propose that it be Madituku, in the sense before this present Dalai Lama passes away, he appoints a young boy as the 15th Dalai Lama. When he grows up in age, as His Holiness passes away, we hope he will live very, very long. But when he passes away, we will have 30 or 35 years old, mature, modern educated, charismatic, spiritually trained, guided by this present Dalai Lama. With his extended charisma, he will be a viable leader to lead the movement again.
Most Tibetans and Tibetan Buddhists are now concerned that when the present Dalai Lama passes away, the Chinese will step in and find their own Dalai Lama.
But I can guarantee you it won't be easy for China to sell that the Chinese version of the Dalai Lama to the Tibetans.
China thinks that if His Holiness passes away, the story of Tibet is gone. But I'm thinking other way around. It will not go, for sure. It will continue. Then the struggle may take a different trend. It is non-violent right now, very peaceful, and a middle way approach, always a conciliatory approach there, but it may change. It may be more violent. It may be only for independence. Then His Holiness, on the other hand, always say, we hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Yeah, every single Tibetan, whether you're a monk or a lay people, every single Tibetans want China out of Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama back to Tibet.
My own feeling is that I think His Holiness will outlive the Communist Party in China.
We should give another opportunity for China to respond to the middle way approach of His Holiness. And then if nothing happens, even the world would know that we tried our best, and then Tibetan people should struggle for complete independence after that.
My hope is that His Holiness himself will personally take responsibility to somehow provide guidance, so that whatever succession system is going to be in place, I think he will have to be personally involved, so that the subsequent, after he's gone, people will take that seriously.
A Tibet controlled by the Communist Party will never be allowed to truly preserve and cultivate their Tibetan identity, culture, and religion, because of the inherent threat that these pose to the Communist Party's single-party rule, and that they've shown that they're increasingly willing to repress and destroy any of these elements of culture and identity in order to maintain their control.
The solution is the Dalai Lama. He is the solution. They think he is the problem. He is the solution.
Sa